Inside a Senate chamber colder than steel, a former doctor turned politician tried to lecture a grieving Congresswoman about the economics of survival. But what happened next left the entire room speechless. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. Instead, she raised the names of the dead. And by the time she asked her final question, even Rand Paul couldn't look her in the eye. If you've ever wondered who really profits when a diabetic dies over a $3 vial of insulin, this is the moment you need to see. Comment where you're watching from, hit that like button, and subscribe, because this story exposes the silence behind America's deadliest price tag. It began with a silence so heavy you could feel it pressing against your chest, like the kind of quiet that comes just before a storm you know will change everything. The Senate chamber wasn't new to history. Its marble floors and echoing rafters had witnessed filibusters, scandals, confessions, and betrayals. But that day, what unfolded inside those walls didn't feel like a hearing. It felt like a trial, not for a person, but for a principle. Whether, in the wealthiest country on earth, a human life had to pass a profitability test to be saved. The room was cold, but it wasn't just the air conditioning. It was the polished, sterile cold of politics. It was the cold of indifference wrapped in policy language. Row after row, spectators sat upright and quiet, clutching folders, pens, and in some cases, pain. Near the back, a woman with graying hair held a framed photograph of a boy who didn't make it past his 16th birthday. He died of diabetic shock. The vial he needed was too expensive. She'd told his story 100 times and would tell it 100 more if it meant something would change. A nurse from Kentucky still wore her scrubs, smeared with the remnants of a night shift that never really ended. She had come not as a professional, but as a witness. Her badge had been swapped for a petition. A man in uniform, oxygen tubes fitted beneath his nostrils, medals from a war no one talked about anymore clinking faintly as he moved, sat closest to the aisle, as if poised to stand when the time came to speak. But no one moved. The weight in the room said this wasn't just another hearing. Then came the procession. First, the aides, stone-faced and carrying binders like shields. Then the press, their cameras swiveling with practiced instinct. And finally, Senator Rand Paul, entering the chamber with the stiff confidence of a man who'd grown far too comfortable being the smartest person in the room. He adjusted his blazer, his red tie sharp as a warning flare, and took his seat with the casual entitlement of someone who believed the country owed him not only deference, but silence. Rand Paul was a doctor, yes, but more importantly, he had spent decades perfecting a particular kind of political performance, one that spoke in equations, ignored the faces behind the facts, and cloaked cruelty in constitutional language. He didn't come to debate that day. He came to defend a system that had made him powerful and had let so many others die quietly. Before the microphones even buzzed to life, he leaned forward and spoke, not as if asking permission, but as if asserting dominance. "Let me be absolutely clear," he said, his voice void of any human warmth. "Healthcare is not a right. It is a commodity, just like a house or a car or a gym membership." That sentence didn't just hang in the air. It landed, hard. An audible gasp rippled through the gallery. A man near the center whispered under his breath, "He just priced life." A woman at the end of the row blinked rapidly, gripping her inhaler, her shoulders drawn up like she'd just been told she didn't matter. But Rand Paul didn't blink. His fingers tapped the wood in front of him with the mechanical rhythm of a man too rehearsed to be rattled. He wasn't here to empathize. He was here to reaffirm an economic sermon that had paid his campaigns well. But then the second door opened, quieter, slower, but no less powerful. Jasmine Crockett walked in like a woman forged in fire and made flame-proof. Her suit was black, not the polished black of political ceremony, but the kind of black worn at funerals, at memorials, in protest. Her eyes held no makeup, only steel. Her lips didn't smile. They pressed tightly, as if they were holding something sacred beneath them. She didn't glance at the crowd. She didn't nod. She walked straight to her seat, placed a folder on the desk, and sat with a calmness that didn't need to be explained. The folder she carried wasn't just a collection of talking points. It was heavy, not in weight, but in meaning. It bulged with color-coded tabs, underlined passages, court transcripts, medical bills, photos, death certificates. It wasn't a binder, it was a battlefield. C-SPAN's cameras zoomed in instinctively, not because anyone had cued them, but because the gravity had shifted. The tension had coiled into something alive, something dangerous, something that, at any second, could shatter the illusion that policy is harmless. Jasmine didn't speak. Not yet. She sat, still, quiet, and across from her sat Rand Paul, arms folded, jaw tight, his eyes scanning her like a man sizing up a challenge he didn't expect to need to prepare for. But then, Jasmine opened the folder. She flipped through the first few pages without a word. Her fingers touched the paper, the way one touches a photograph of someone they've lost. Delicate, deliberate, mournful. The room had stilled, no coughs, no rustling of notes. Even the cameras seemed to zoom quieter. She lifted her gaze, not just to Rand Paul, but to the room, and then, slowly, to the American people watching through every screen. She didn't open with a statement. She opened with a name. Maria Gutierrez, she said, 37, Dallas, Texas. She paused. The name floated into the air, took its seat among the rows, and refused to be ignored. She worked nights cleaning offices, days cash registering at a gas station. She had no insurance. She rationed her insulin to feed her children. 3 weeks later, she was dead. No thunder, no raised voice, just facts, heavy, final. And then, a whisper through the gallery, a woman in scrubs leaned into her husband's shoulder and quietly said, "That could have been me." Jasmine turned toward the screen behind her and clicked a small remote. A stark slide lit the room. Cost to manufacture 1 vial of insulin, $3. She waited. Then another click. Average cost charged to Americans, $340. You could feel the room's air shift. Not just gasp, recoil. The kind of involuntary reaction your body gives when you've just seen something too cruel to process. A man in the back crossed himself. A reporter lowered his pen. The nurse clutched her clipboard tighter, not to write, but to hold on to something real, while the floor of morality beneath her seemed to crack. Rand Paul said nothing. His eyes stayed still, but his jawline had tightened. His fingers stopped tapping. Jasmine didn't need to shout, didn't need to cry. She just turned to him, calm, unshaken, and said, "Senator Paul, how much is a life worth in this country?" That wasn't a question, that was a hammer. And it had just struck the first blow in a trial America didn't know it was on the jury for. The silence that followed Jasmine's question didn't settle like dust. It clung like smoke. How much is a life worth in this country? It wasn't rhetorical. It was surgical. It cut through every committee member, every aide, every viewer at home, clutching their coffee cup a little tighter, frozen mid-sip, waiting to see if anyone, especially the man seated across from her, had the spine to answer. Rand Paul shifted in his seat, but not in discomfort, in calculation. He'd been cornered before, on cable news, in town halls, even once during a raucous debate in Kentucky. But this wasn't like those times. This wasn't a soundbite. This was a reckoning. And this time, the courtroom wasn't watching from a distance. This time, the courtroom was America. He leaned forward just a little, enough for the microphone to pick up the hiss of his breath before he spoke. "Let me respond," he said, his tone so smooth it could have been mistaken for calm. This is exactly the kind of emotional grandstanding that distorts serious debate." There it was, the familiar pivot. Turn grief into performance. Turn names into props. Frame the facts as theater and call your opponent an actor. Rand had made a career out of speaking above people's heads, counting on detachment to protect him. But this time, the audience wasn't looking up to him. They were looking right through him. "Healthcare," he continued, "isn't about anecdotes. It's about outcomes. It's about sustainability. It's about what works for a free society." He didn't look at Jasmine while he spoke. He looked out, past the people watching, past the room, filled with grief, straight into the lens of the camera. Because this wasn't for her. It was for the headlines, for the lobbyists, for the donors, for the next fundraiser dinner with CEOs whose hands shook not from age, but from the weight of stock portfolios riding on every prescription refill. In Canada, he went on, people wait 6 months for a diagnosis, 6 months to see a specialist. That's what government-run healthcare looks like. That's what happens when the state decides who gets to live. He paused, not for breath, but for effect. I've operated on patients who fled those systems, who were abandoned by their governments. I know what happens when socialism replaces science. I've seen it. And then, slowly, surgically, his voice lowered. Representative Crockett is not here to offer solutions. She's here to weaponize sympathy. And frankly, he turned toward her now, just enough for the camera to catch his expression. I've seen better actors. The insult wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It was a whisper designed to slap. A few aides blinked rapidly. One of the photographers let out a barely audible exhale, the kind you make when you realize you've just witnessed something ugly, but not illegal. But Jasmine still didn't move. Her hands stayed folded. Her gaze didn't flicker. Because while Rand spoke of economics, she carried the weight of economics on the backs of mothers who had buried their children with unpaid pharmacy bills still stuffed in their purses. She let him finish. Completely. She waited until his voice had emptied every ounce of sanctimony and spin into the chamber, and then, quietly, she clicked the remote again. The screen behind her flickered. No charts this time, just text, white on black. Insulin doesn't fail. The system does. She didn't comment on it. She didn't explain it, because some truths speak louder when left alone. She reached for a second folder, thinner than the first, opened it, and took out a single laminated sheet. Then she spoke, not to Paul, not even to the room, to the people. This, she said, holding up the page, is the grocery receipt Maria Gutierrez left behind on her kitchen table the day before she died. The camera zoomed in. The handwriting was small, the ink slightly smudged. On the right-hand corner, circled twice, was one word, insulin, $304. Beneath it, in messier writing, cancel, circled again. Then beneath that, just 2 more words, written in what looked like shaky penmanship, kids' food. Jasmine lowered the paper. She didn't cancel the food. That sentence didn't have statistics, but it had weight. Because a mother would rather die than watch her children go hungry. The veteran in the 3rd row bowed his head. The woman with the framed photo pressed it against her chest. The nurse wiped her eyes and whispered a name only she could hear. And yet, across the room, Rand Paul shifted again, not in empathy, but in irritation, as if her truth was inconvenient for his ideology. He straightened his tie, raised his chin, and took a deep breath as if preparing to reclaim control of the room, but Jasmine beat him to it. "Do you want to talk about outcomes, Senator?" she asked, her voice steady, unfaltering. "Let's talk about them." She clicked again, this time, a chart. 3 pharmaceutical companies, $47.3 billion in profits. Next click, an internal corporate memo, highlighted, underlined. The American market remains elastic, push price, pain threshold not yet visible. No actor could have written a line like that, because no screenwriter would have dared imagine it was real. The pain threshold, not of the body, but of the wallet. That phrase didn't just stun the chamber, it strangled it. Jasmine didn't explain the memo. She didn't need to. The words were already beginning to rot in the open air. "They're not studying how to cure pain," she said. "They're studying how much pain the American public will tolerate before they fight back." Then she paused, her voice softening. "Senator Paul, you talk about Canada. You talk about waiting for treatment. But do you know what's worse than waiting for care?" She turned back toward him. "Knowing exactly what you need to stay alive, and not being allowed to have it, because the price of your life was set by a boardroom." He didn't reply. He couldn't. Because when truth is that precise, silence isn't avoidance. It's confession. The room was silent, but not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that crackled with static, thick with the sound of pride about to break and power about to panic. Jasmine Crockett had just laid bare not only the greed behind a $340 vial of insulin, but the clinical cruelty behind the word elastic, a word that, in a boardroom, had been used to define just how much Americans could suffer before they snapped. Rand Paul, however, hadn't blinked. He didn't lean back in reflection. He didn't glance down in shame. Instead, he did something else, something the cameras caught, zoomed in on, and would later replay in millions of homes across the country. He smiled. Not the smile of amusement, not the smile of victory, but the smirk of someone who believed he was untouchable, who believed numbers could bury names and theory could outlast truth. It was quick, barely a twitch at the corner of his mouth. But it was there. A grin, born not of joy, but of control. And Jasmine saw it. She didn't react, not visibly. But something shifted in the air around her. A stillness, deeper than silence. A calm, like the ocean, before it swallows the ship. She clicked again. The screen behind her lit up, not with statistics this time, but with a new kind of weapon. A video, grainy, unpolished, clearly captured by a cell phone. The timestamp in the corner indicated it was filmed during a closed-door healthcare summit held in D.C. just a year earlier. The setting was sterile, a boardroom bathed in too much fluorescent light, its windows covered with blackout blinds to keep the press out. At the front of the room stood a man in a navy suit with a soft gray pocket square. He looked confident, relaxed, and then he spoke. "If we don't raise drug prices, our shareholders will sue us." He chuckled. So did the men and women seated around the conference table. Jasmine said nothing. The room said nothing. But the silence now wasn't neutral. It was accusatory. She didn't explain the clip. She didn't have to, because in those 9 words, the entire defense of free market medicine collapsed. She turned to Rand Paul, her expression unwavering. "This is not economics. This is extortion, and the only reason it survives is because men like you keep defending it." Rand's eyes narrowed. That smirk was gone now, evaporated like fog under flame. "This is the model you've defended," she said. "This is the freedom you champion. Freedom for whom? Certainly not Maria Gutierrez. Certainly not the thousands who die each year waiting for insulin. No, sir. This freedom is reserved for the ones in that video. The ones who laugh when someone says, 'Raise the price,' or else." Then she paused, not because she needed to, but because the room needed to catch up. And when she spoke again, her voice had changed. It had weight, legacy. "Senator Paul, you trained as a doctor. You took an oath. First, do no harm. But look around you. Look at what's been done in your name, under your banner, beneath your silence." She stepped away from the microphone, picked up a sheet of brown craft paper from beneath her folder. It was thick, worn, folded 3 times. Slowly, she unfolded it. Once, twice, 3 times, and then she spread it across the desk in front of her. The names came into view. At first, the senators in the chamber squinted, unsure what they were seeing. But then they realized. It was a list of the dead, names, ages, cities, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, typed in tight, orderly columns. No graphics, no bold colors, just black ink on brown paper. "This," Jasmine said quietly, "is just 1 year, from just one state, Texas." She placed both hands on the paper, gently, as if it were sacred, because to her, it was. "These are people who died, not because we didn't have the medicine, but because we didn't let them have it." She began to read, not loudly, not with anger, but with the kind of clarity that makes the room lean in. Carlos Ramirez, 52, San Antonio. Ayanna Fields, 28, Lubbock. Levi Grant, 33, Plano. Naomi Washington, 41, Waco. Each name hit the room like thunder in a church. The walls didn't shake, but the hearts inside them did. Rand Paul's face was still, but it wasn't calm. It was rigid. His jaw set, his fingers clenched. Because this wasn't a debate anymore. This was testimony. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to win an argument. She was here to bury the silence with names. She paused at one name, longer than the others. Benjamin Morris, 14, Dallas. A soft gasp rippled from the gallery. A mother in the second row cupped her hand over her mouth. The photograph she'd been holding dropped into her lap. That was her son. Jasmine didn't say so. She didn't need to. Because when grief is recognized, it doesn't need announcement. It only needs room. She looked up, her voice still steady. "These names are not talking points. They're not props. They're not, as you say, emotional grandstanding. They are people, gone. because someone decided their suffering didn't cost enough. Rand Paul shifted again, this time not to speak, but to withstand. But Jasmine wasn't done. She clicked again. Another slide, a bar graph. Simple, devastating. Pharmaceutical donations to Senator Rand Paul, 2013-2023, $4,300,000. No commentary, just a red outline around the final number. It didn't scream, it accused. The gallery stilled, cameras zoomed, and Jasmine? She just stood beside the screen, silent, unmoving. And that silence, that moment, did what hours of debate never could. It forced the entire chamber to see, to connect the $304 grocery receipt with the $4.3 million donation ledger, to draw the line from a closed casket funeral to a closed-door fundraiser. Rand Paul stared at the slide, his expression unchanged. But something had cracked, not his posture, his armor. Because you can hide behind policy, but you cannot hide from truth, not when it's 10 feet tall and glowing on a Senate screen. And in that silence, Jasmine stepped forward, not to summarize, not to beg, just to say one thing. We are not asking for charity. We are asking for justice. And the moment hung in the air like a flag refusing to fall. The air in the chamber was still, but heavy, thick with the gravity of unspoken truths, finally brought into daylight. Rand Paul sat frozen, his $4.3 million pharmaceutical donation total still glowing behind him like an epitaph carved into digital stone. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She stood in silence, not for effect, but because the moment itself demanded reverence. This wasn't politics anymore. It was an autopsy. Not of a policy, but of a nation's conscience. And Jasmine wasn't just a congresswoman at that moment. She was something older, something deeper. She was every nurse who's cried behind a curtain because a family couldn't afford the medication. She was every mother who skipped her own prescription to buy cereal. Every veteran who sold his medals to pay for cancer treatment. She was what truth looks like when it finally decides to stop knocking and starts breaking the door down. And then, he broke. Rand Paul, who had weathered years of criticism, who had smiled through scandals and sidestepped moral accountability with the agility of a practiced politician, stood. Abruptly. The screech of his chair against marble echoed like a scream in a cathedral. He didn't ask for the floor, he took it. I have dedicated my entire life to medicine, he barked, his voice cracking in a way that was almost human. Almost. I have saved lives, performed surgeries, helped families in ways you can't imagine. His hand slammed onto the table. You. He jabbed a finger in the air, not quite pointing at Jasmine, but circling her like prey. You have no right to question my integrity. You are not a doctor. You are not even a policymaker. You're a performer. The insult wasn't subtle, but it wasn't strategic either. It was the sound of someone who thought credentials would protect him from truth. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't rise. She didn't even blink. She waited, like an avalanche waits for the last snowflake. Rand leaned forward now, both hands on the table, red in the face, posture puffed with a kind of desperation he couldn't contain. You sit there, reading names like you're handing out indictments, but you don't understand the economics, the infrastructure, the supply chain, the real work that goes into making our system run. He looked around the room, eyes scanning for an ally. None spoke, because the more he shouted, the more alone he became. And then he said it, the sentence that would etch itself into every headline by nightfall. You talk about morality like it's simple, like all we have to do is throw money at dying people and call it compassion. But real morality, real medicine, is about limits. It's about sacrifice. You can't save everyone. His voice broke, and the room did too, but not in his favor. A woman in the gallery let out a sob. She wasn't crying for the first time. She was crying because she had finally heard the quiet part said out loud. You can't save everyone. That's what they think of us, the elderly man next to her whispered, that we're numbers, that we're fractions in someone's spreadsheet, that our lives only matter if they don't cost too much. Rand Paul stood there, breathing heavy, his argument bleeding out in the center of the room. And Jasmine? She finally spoke. Thank you. She said it gently. So gently, it felt like a whisper across a battlefield. Because now, everyone sees it. She clicked the remote. The screen changed, not to a document, not to a chart, but to a still image, captured from a smartphone, time-stamped, unfiltered. Rand Paul, speaking at a pharmaceutical policy summit, smiling. Captioned beneath his face were the exact words he had said on stage just months earlier. We need to protect the freedom to price pharmaceuticals. No doctor, no Hippocratic oath, just a politician defending profit over people. She turned to him now, not with anger, but with something more powerful, certainty. You can talk about freedom, Senator, but let's tell the truth about what kind of freedom you're defending. She walked to the center of the room, not in arrogance, but in purpose. Because freedom isn't real when a child dies because their mother couldn't afford a needle. Freedom doesn't exist when a grandfather cuts his pills in half to stretch out one more week. Freedom doesn't mean anything when it's only given to the wealthy and the well-connected. That's not liberty. That's licensed cruelty. Her voice dropped now, deeper, slower, like a eulogy. And let me tell you something, Dr. Paul. When the doctor works for the drug dealers, it's not healthcare, it's hostage-taking. The room stilled, not a breath, not a whisper, just the weight of what had just been said. She let it sit, let it rot in the air, because truth doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it just needs a moment of silence. For a moment, even time seemed to hesitate. Jasmine Crockett's final sentence. When the doctor works for the drug dealers, it's not healthcare, it's hostage-taking. Didn't land like a mic drop. It settled like judgment. And it didn't come from rage. It came from exhaustion, from generations of sacrifice, from 1,000 silent funerals that never made headlines. Rand Paul remained standing, but something had shifted. Not his height, his stature. For the first time in that chamber, the man who entered with a surgeon's poise and a senator's power looked small. Not because Jasmine had raised her voice, but because she had spoken from somewhere he couldn't reach. The lived experience of the people he pretended to legislate for, but had long stopped seeing. The room didn't erupt. It lowered. A reverent hush. A silence not of submission, but of understanding. And then, Jasmine looked up again. Not at Rand Paul, not even at the committee, but at the camera, at the country. And with the clarity of someone who had carried too many names to whisper any longer, she asked a question that would redefine the debate. Who saves the patient when the doctor chooses stocks over survival? No metaphor, no preamble, just that question. And it tore through the marble pillars of the Senate like a wrecking ball. People didn't respond right away. They absorbed it. Because for millions watching at home, grandparents on fixed incomes, parents skipping prescriptions, veterans clutching approval forms, the question didn't feel rhetorical. It felt personal. And Rand Paul? He sat down. Slowly. Because what could he say? What rebuttal could compete with a mother's obituary or a teenager's empty inhaler? Jasmine didn't press the moment. She didn't boast. She didn't gloat. She simply walked back to her seat, the brown list of names still spread like a holy text across the table in front of her. For several minutes, the chamber just breathed, and for once, no one talked over her, not because they couldn't, but because they shouldn't. And in that pause, something happened far beyond the walls of the Capitol. A reckoning, online, in living rooms, in waiting rooms, in pharmacies, began to unfold. And the clip that changed everything. It started small, a 17-second video clip. Just Jasmine Crockett, seated quietly across from Rand Paul. The frame caught her face, perfectly, steady, composed, without anger or tears. The quote, captioned in bold white letters beneath her, "I'm not lecturing on morality. I'm asking one question. Who saves the patient when the doctor chooses stocks over survival?" By sundown, the clip had exploded across social media. Within hours, it had been shared over 3.4 million times. By midnight, it had passed 40 million views. TikTok users reenacted the exchange. Nurses in Kansas, Florida, and Michigan filmed themselves reading names from their own patient lists, adding captions, "These are my Marias." Instagram flooded with black and white screenshots of Jasmine, frozen in mid-sentence, framed by the brown list of names in front of her. Reddit turned into a storm of confessions. Stories of fathers lost, children failed, mothers bankrupted by medication they needed to live. But it wasn't just outrage. It was a kind of awakening, a remembering of something this country once promised: life, liberty, and justice, and how far we had strayed from it. On Twitter, now X, 3 hashtags surged to the top. Seekals insulin is life. Xiangqi, Jasmine was right. Jarche, health is a human right. And in the middle of the night, someone projected Jasmine's final quote onto the side of a pharmaceutical headquarters in New Jersey. Who saves the patient when the doctor chooses stocks over survival? The following day, a collective letter, signed by over 24,000 medical students across all 50 states, was published in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the Wall Street Journal. The headline read, "We refuse to take this oath with our eyes closed," and inside it said, "We are ashamed, not of medicine, but of what we've allowed it to become. We pledge to heal. We do not pledge to enrich." Jasmine Crockett reminded us what our future should look like, and we will not betray it. Soon after, dozens of physicians resigned from advisory panels tied to pharmaceutical lobbying groups. Some posted their resignation letters publicly. One wrote, "I didn't go to medical school to help balance someone's stock portfolio. I went to save lives. Jasmine Crockett just reminded me of that." 3 days after the hearing, something remarkable happened. In cities across the country, candlelight vigils were held, not by politicians, but by people. From Boston to Bakersfield, communities gathered in parks, church parking lots, and VFW halls. They brought brown paper. They wrote names, and they read them aloud. Maria Gutierrez, Benjamin Morris, Naomi Washington. They lit candles. They held signs. They cried together. And they didn't ask for silence. They took it. And in that silence, something was reborn. Community. Purpose. A reminder that democracy doesn't belong to marble buildings or piacs. It belongs to us. The morning after the vigil in Dallas, Jasmine Crockett stood on the steps of a community clinic with one piece of paper in her hand, a draft bill, titled the Insulin for All Act. The premise was simple: cap insulin prices at the cost of production, plus no more than 10%. Outlaw pharmaceutical price hikes not tied to clinical innovation. Strip lobbying access from any company found manipulating drug markets for shareholder gain. When she stepped to the microphone, she didn't begin with politics. She began with a name. "Maria Gutierrez," she said, voice clear and steady. "You didn't die in vain." Then she looked out into the crowd of reporters, citizens, and cameras and said what needed to be said. "This is not charity. This is accountability. And if Congress won't do it, we will." That clip was shorter than the first, just 8 seconds, but it didn't need to be longer. Because America had already chosen its side. Rand Paul, once poised and unbothered, now found himself drowning in backlash. Editorial boards called for his resignation from key healthcare committees. Ethics groups demanded investigations into his donor connections. And in Kentucky, local stations aired town halls, where former supporters now asked the same question Jasmine had posed. Who saves us if our doctors stop choosing us? He tried to recover, went on TV, gave long answers filled with graphs and percentages, but it was too late. He wasn't being heard anymore. He was being remembered, and not for what he'd built, but for what he'd defended. The story didn't fade because it never really was a story. It was a mirror, held up to a system too long protected by complexity and indifference. Jasmine Crockett didn't just break a narrative, she built a movement. And movements don't die in silence, they live in legislation. In late-night conversations between grandparents and grandchildren about what kind of country we want to be. In the quiet rage of pharmacists forced to deny medicine. In the tearful prayers of parents watching their kids sleep, hoping tomorrow they can still afford the pills. And in the final words of this video, if this moved you, don't just watch. Act. Ask your representative if they support the Insulin for All Act. If they dodge, record it. If they lie, replace them. If they say yes, thank them and hold them to it. Because this fight isn't about politics. It's about pulse. It's about whether our system serves people or profit. Jasmine Crockett stood alone so that no one else would have to. Now it's our turn. Comment your story below. Have you or someone you love been impacted by drug pricing? Say their name. Let them be heard. Like this video if you believe healthcare is a right, not a privilege. Subscribe for more stories that fight for the voiceless. And remember, justice doesn't begin in Washington. It begins when people like us decide enough is enough.